When the Australian Maritime Safety Authority received a satellite distress signal on March 3rd, 2023, from a position 890 nautical miles east of Brisbane, they expected another routine rescue operation. What they found instead would expose a disturbing pattern that maritime authorities had been quietly tracking for over 2 decades. A pattern that challenges everything we thought we knew about abandoned vessels in the Pacific Ocean. The 38-foot sloop Wandering Star was spotted by a cargo ship's crew, floating motionless in calm seas. Her hull showed no signs of collision damage. Her mast stood straight and true. Her rigging remained intact. But something was profoundly wrong. The boat had been deliberately stripped, not by pirates or salvagers, but systematically dismantled in a way that suggested intimate knowledge of her systems. Every piece of electronics had been surgically removed. The life raft was gone, but its mounting bracket showed careful unbuckling rather than emergency deployment. Most disturbing of all, the through-hull fittings had been opened from the inside, a slow-motion scuttling that would take days to sink the vessel. The boat's registered owner, 52-year-old Martin Ashworth, was eventually found alive 3 weeks later in Fiji, selling marine equipment at local markets. He wasn't a victim. He wasn't lost. He was part of something far more complex than anyone had imagined. In this investigation, we're going to uncover a hidden maritime phenomenon that's been occurring in the Pacific for decades, reveal the economic and psychological forces driving experienced sailors to abandon their dreams, and expose an underground network that's turning ghost ships into a black market commodity. Martin Ashworth represented everything people romanticize about the sailing lifestyle. A former telecommunications engineer from Perth, he had spent 15 years meticulously planning his retirement cruise. He'd sold his house, liquidated his superannuation, and purchased Wandering Star, a well-maintained Beneteau Oceanus 38 that had cost him $185,000 AUD. His plan was textbook: cruise the South Pacific Islands, maybe write a blog, live the dream that thousands of office workers fantasize about during their lunch breaks. Martin wasn't naive. He had completed advanced navigation courses, earned his Yachtmaster certification, and spent 2 years doing shorter coastal passages to build experience. He had installed a new Raymarine chart plotter system, upgraded the rigging, and even took a diesel mechanics course to maintain his Volvo Penta engine. His departure from Sydney in October 2022 was celebrated by the local sailing community, another brave soul escaping the rat race for tropical freedom. But what the farewell party didn't know was that Martin's carefully calculated budget had already begun to crack. The dream that looked perfect on paper was colliding with the harsh mathematics of cruising reality, and Martin was far from alone. The Pacific Ocean has long been considered the ultimate cruising ground: warm waters, stunning islands, and consistent trade winds. What the glossy sailing magazines don't emphasize is that it's also one of the most expensive cruising regions in the world. Remote island nations depend heavily on imports, creating price structures that can bankrupt unprepared cruisers. Martin's budget had allocated $3,000 AUD monthly for all expenses. Within 3 months, he was spending nearly double that. In New Caledonia, marina fees consumed $450 per week. A broken forestay in Vanuatu cost $1,200 to replace. Cyclone insurance, which he'd foolishly skipped initially, cost him $3,800 after he realized the risk. Fresh provisions in remote islands sometimes cost triple what he'd paid in Australia. A simple boat card for internet access in French Polynesia, $200 for 50 gigas. Each month, his savings evaporated faster than he could adjust his expectations. But the financial pressure was only one dimension of the problem. The psychological weight of maintaining a cruising boat in the Pacific was something no course had prepared him for. The constant awareness that every system could fail, that every weather forecast could trap you in an expensive marina for weeks, that every mechanical problem was your problem to solve without the safety net of HIAA or local mechanics. Marine insurers have documented this pattern extensively. According to data from Pantaenius and other major underwriters, approximately 18% of boats that depart Australia for Pacific cruising never complete their intended circuit. Some return early. Some are sold at significant losses in foreign ports. And some, like Wandering Star, simply disappear from the registry, abandoned by owners who see no other way out. Martin's logs, later recovered from a backup hard drive he'd mailed to his sister, reveal the psychological deterioration that accompanies financial desperation at sea. His early entries are enthusiastic, filled with sunset descriptions and the joy of anchoring in pristine bays. By January 2023, the tone had shifted dramatically. "Spent 6 hours today trying to fix the watermaker," he wrote on January 14th. "The membrane is shot. Replacement costs $1,400 plus shipping to Fiji. I'm drinking rainwater and rationing my jerry cans. My cruising kitty has $8,000 left. At this burn rate, I'll be broke in 3 months. The boat is worth maybe $120,000 here in the Pacific market, but I own nothing on her. She's my only asset. She's also becoming my prison." This is the crisis point that maritime authorities have identified across dozens of abandonment cases. The boat owner reaches a psychological crossroads where the vessel transforms from a dream into a liability. Selling a foreign-registered boat in Pacific Island nations involves complex bureaucracy, import duties, and often months of waiting for paperwork. Many owners discover that their boat's value has plummeted due to harsh marine conditions, deferred maintenance, and a limited buyer market. The rational choice would be to arrange transport back to Australia or accept a significant financial loss on a local sale. But rationality often fails when people are stressed, isolated, and watching their life savings drain away in paradise. What Martin discovered in Fiji's cruising community would offer him a different solution, one that operated in the shadows of legitimate maritime commerce. He met Thomas Reynard at a cruiser's potluck in Musket Cove Marina, Fiji. Thomas, a weathered New Zealander in his 60s, had been cruising the Pacific for over 20 years. He seemed to know everyone, helped newcomers with local knowledge, and was generous with boat repair advice. Thomas was also a facilitator in an underground network that had been operating since the late 1990s. Over beers, with the careful vagueness of someone discussing something semi-legal, Thomas explained how it worked. Boats in financial distress could be retired from service in a way that maximized recovery for the owner, while technically staying within the gray areas of maritime law. The process was surprisingly systematic. First, the owner would strip all valuable electronics, safety equipment, and easily removable hardware. These items would be sold through Thomas's network of contacts, marine chandleries in Fiji, Vanuatu, and Tonga that asked few questions about provenance. The owner would receive approximately 40–60% of the item's used value in cash, usually within a week. Then came the vessel itself. The owner would sail to a predetermined position in international waters, open the through-hull fittings to begin slow flooding, and deploy the life raft. A pre-arranged fishing vessel or cargo ship would rescue the sailor, who would report that the boat had developed catastrophic leaks from unknown causes. The boat would be documented as abandoned in distress. The EPIRB would be activated and the owner would be transported to the nearest port. The insurance claim would follow naturally. If the boat was insured, and most weren't by this point, as many owners had let policies lapse to save money, the owner would claim total loss. If uninsured, the boat would simply be reported as lost to the Maritime Authority, and the owner would return home broke, but debt-free. The stripped equipment sales would provide enough cash for airfare and a small cushion to restart their lives. The boat itself would eventually sink or drift until it became a navigation hazard, later destroyed by authorities or scavenged by the same network that facilitated the abandonment. Maritime authorities have been aware of this pattern for years, but face significant challenges in prosecution. The Australian Maritime Safety Authority estimates that between 15 and 25 recreational vessels are abandoned in the Pacific annually under suspicious circumstances. The actual number is likely higher, as many boats simply disappear from tracking systems without distress signals. French Polynesia's marine police have documented at least 40 cases since 2010 where vessels were found stripped and deliberately scuttled. New Caledonia reported 18 similar cases between 2015 and 2022. Fiji has become a particular hotspot, with local authorities documenting dozens of suspicious abandonments, though prosecution is rare due to jurisdictional complexity and lack of resources. The environmental impact is substantial. A slowly sinking fiberglass yacht can take months to fully submerge, during which time it poses collision risks to other vessels. Once on the seabed, fiberglass doesn't biodegrade. It fragments into smaller pieces over decades, contributing to marine microplastic pollution. Fuel and oil from engine compartments contaminate reef systems. Lead from keels creates toxic zones on the ocean floor. The financial impact on the marine insurance industry is equally significant. Lloyd's of London estimated in a 2021 internal report that fraudulent abandonment claims in the Pacific cost underwriters approximately 15 to 20 million USD annually. This has led to increasingly strict policy requirements, higher premiums for Pacific cruising, and more aggressive investigation of total loss claims. But perhaps the most insidious impact is cultural. The cruising community has long operated on trust, mutual aid, and shared knowledge. The existence of abandonment networks has introduced suspicion and secrecy. Long-term cruisers have become cautious about who they share information with. Marinas and harbor masters in Pacific nations now view distressed cruisers with skepticism rather than offering immediate help. Martin wrestled with the decision for 3 weeks. His logs reveal a man torn between his ethical standards and his desperation. "I built my career on integrity," he wrote on February 10th. "I've never cheated on my taxes, never lied on an insurance form, never taken something that wasn't mine. But I'm 52 years old, sitting on a boat I can't afford to maintain and can't sell without losing everything, in a foreign country where I don't speak the language well enough to work legally. The dream has become a trap." Thomas had explained that the process was victimless. The equipment sales went to other cruisers who needed affordable parts. The boat would sink in deep water, far from reefs or shipping lanes. The insurance company, if there was one, would process the claim as they did hundreds of others. "The Pacific is full of ghost ships," Thomas had said. "You're just adding one more to a long tradition." On February 28th, Martin began the process. Over 3 days, he systematically removed the chart plotter, VHF radio, AIS transponder, autopilot computer, wind instruments, and depth sounder. He took his storm sails, spare anchors, life jackets, and emergency flares. He even removed the expensive LED navigation lights he'd installed the previous year. Each item was catalogued, photographed, and priced by Thomas's contact in Suva. The equipment sale generated $8,400 AUD in cash. It wasn't enough to fully recoup his losses, but combined with his remaining cruising funds, it would get him home and provide a few months of cushion while he rebuilt his life. On March 3rd, 2023, Martin sailed Wandering Star to a position 890 nautical miles east of Brisbane, in waters over 4,000 meters deep. The weather was calm, the seas nearly flat, conditions that felt almost ceremonial. He had prepared for this moment with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to navigation planning. He opened the through-hull fittings in the forward head and engine compartment, creating 2 slow leaks that would take approximately 36 hours to sink the vessel. He activated the EPIRB from the life raft, ensuring a distress signal without leaving it aboard to be recovered with the boat. He took a final walk through the cabin, remembering the excitement of purchase day, the hope he'd felt sailing out of Sydney Harbour, the dream that had sustained him through 15 years of planning. Then he boarded the life raft and drifted. The prearranged fishing vessel Southern Pacific, operating out of Suva, was scheduled to pass within 5 nautical miles of his position. The timing worked perfectly. 4 hours after abandoning ship, Martin was aboard Southern Pacific, wrapped in a blanket, being offered hot tea and sympathy by a crew that had performed this service at least a dozen times before. The captain, a Fijian named Joji, asked no questions beyond what maritime law required. Martin's story was simple. Catastrophic hull damage from an unknown impact, water flooding faster than pumps could handle, forced to abandon ship. Joji nodded, made the required radio reports, and altered course for Suva. Wandering Star was spotted by a cargo vessel 30 hours later, listing heavily but still afloat. By the time the Australian Maritime Safety Authority could dispatch a response, she had slipped beneath the surface, joining the countless other vessels resting on the Pacific floor. What Martin hadn't anticipated was the persistence of maritime investigator Sarah Chen. Chen, a former Australian federal police officer who had specialized in maritime fraud, had been tracking the pattern of Pacific abandonments for 3 years. The Wandering Star case triggered multiple red flags in her analysis system. The EPIRB activation occurred in deep water, far from any logical navigation route between major ports. The vessel had no insurance claim filed, unusual, as most owners would at least attempt recovery. Martin's social media presence abruptly ended, with no posts about a dramatic sinking or narrow escape. And most tellingly, Chen's network of informants in Pacific marine chandleries reported a sudden influx of Ray Marine equipment matching Wandering Star's specifications. Chen traveled to Fiji and began quiet inquiries. She interviewed marina staff, showed photographs, tracked cash transactions through cooperative shop owners. Within 2 weeks, she had identified Thomas Reynard as a person of interest and begun surveillance of his movements. The break came from an unexpected source. A cruiser named Elena Martinez, who had purchased a VHF radio through Thomas's network, later discovered it was registered to Wandering Star. Elena, an honest sailor who assumed she was simply buying used equipment, contacted Australian authorities when she realized the boat had been reported as sunk. Her testimony provided the link Chen needed. Martin was located in Fiji 3 weeks after the abandonment, living in backpacker accommodation and selling remaining equipment at the Suva market. When confronted by Chen and local police, he initially maintained his story of catastrophic hull failure. But faced with evidence of the equipment sales, the pre-arranged rescue, and testimony from Southern Pacific's crew, his resolve crumbled. Martin's case, while dramatic, represents only one node in a much larger network. Chen's investigation eventually identified similar operations in Vanuatu, Tonga, and New Caledonia. The facilitators ranged from long-term cruisers like Thomas Reynard to local marine business owners who saw opportunity in the steady stream of financially distressed foreigners. The economics driving the network are simple and brutal. A $150,000 boat stripped of $15,000 in electronics and equipment, abandoned in international waters, represents a calculated loss that many desperate owners accept. The alternative, selling at a 50% loss in a slow market while bleeding money for months, often seems worse. The facilitators take their percentage, usually 40% of equipment sales, and maintain plausible deniability by never directly participating in the abandonment itself. They're simply helping cruisers sell used equipment and connecting people in distress with local resources. The legal gray areas are substantial, and prosecution requires proof of conspiracy that's difficult to establish across multiple jurisdictions. Maritime authorities in Pacific nations have responded with increased surveillance of cruising boats, mandatory check-ins for foreign vessels, and cooperation agreements to share information about suspicious abandonments. The Australian Border Force now conducts exit interviews with returning cruisers who report boat losses, looking for inconsistencies in their stories. Insurance companies have become more aggressive in investigating Pacific claims, using satellite tracking data, AIS records, and forensic analysis of ePIRB activations to identify suspicious patterns. Some underwriters now require monthly position reports for boats cruising the Pacific, with policies voiding if boats deviate from declared routes without notification. Beyond the legal and environmental implications, the abandonment network reveals uncomfortable truths about the cruising dream that the marine industry rarely acknowledges. The fantasy of escaping to a simpler life at sea collides with the reality that boats are complex, expensive machines requiring constant maintenance, that remote islands have limited infrastructure and high costs, and that the psychological challenge of extended isolation can break even well-prepared sailors. Martin Ashworth's story, stripped of its criminal elements, is heartbreaking. A man who did everything right, saved responsibly, trained properly, prepared carefully, still found himself in a situation where abandoning his dream seemed like the only option. His case highlights the need for more honest discussion within the cruising community about the financial and psychological realities of extended ocean voyaging. Chen's investigation also revealed that Martin wasn't unique. She documented at least 30 other cases with similar profiles: middle-aged professionals, well-equipped boats, careful planning, followed by financial crisis and desperate decisions. Most were never prosecuted due to insufficient evidence or jurisdictional challenges. They simply returned home, their boats resting on the Pacific floor, their stories becoming cautionary tales whispered in marina bars. In response to the growing abandonment problem, maritime authorities and cruising organizations have begun implementing reform. The Ocean Cruising Club now requires prospective Pacific cruisers to complete a realistic budgeting workshop that includes worst-case scenarios and emergency contingency planning. Several countries have implemented deposit systems where cruising boats must post bonds sufficient to cover abandonment cleanup costs, refundable upon proper exit or documented sale. The Seven Seas Cruising Association launched a confidential distressed cruiser support program in 2022, connecting sailors facing financial or mechanical crises with resources, loans, and practical solutions. The program has helped over 40 boats avoid abandonment by facilitating legitimate sales, arranging affordable transport to better markets, or connecting owners with emergency funds. Some cruising advocates argue for better pre-departure screening, requiring proof of adequate financial reserves, comprehensive insurance, and mechanical competency before issuing cruising permits. Others resist such measures as overly restrictive, arguing that the vast majority of cruisers complete their voyages responsibly and that regulations punish ethical sailors for the actions of a desperate few. The marine insurance industry has proposed a Pacific Cruising Certification Program that would provide premium discounts for sailors completing advanced training in budgeting, emergency repairs, and psychological resilience. Early pilot programs have shown promising results, with certified cruisers showing significantly lower abandonment and claims rates. The phenomenon of deliberately abandoned sailboats in the Pacific represents a complex intersection of economic pressure, psychological stress, environmental damage, and criminal opportunity. It's a problem that the cruising community has been reluctant to acknowledge publicly, fearing it would tarnish the romantic image of sailing and discourage new participants. But silence serves no one. The boats keep sinking. The networks keep operating, and sailors like Martin Ashworth keep finding themselves in impossible situations where criminal activity seems like the only escape. Martin eventually pleaded guilty to insurance fraud and filing false maritime distress reports. He received a suspended sentence and a substantial fine, contingent on his cooperation in identifying other network participants. Thomas Reynard was charged with conspiracy and marine environmental crimes, but disappeared before trial, reportedly sailing to Indonesia beyond the reach of Pacific law enforcement. Wandering Star rests somewhere on the Pacific floor, 4 kilometers down, her hull slowly fragmenting into the sediment. She's one of dozens abandoned in the past decade, a fleet of ghost ships that represent both broken dreams and environmental time bombs. The Pacific Ocean remains one of the world's great cruising grounds, offering experiences that enrich and transform those who venture across its vastness. But it also tests sailors in ways that go beyond navigation skills and seamanship. It tests their financial preparation, their psychological resilience, and ultimately their ethical boundaries when the dream collides with reality. For everyone who romanticizes the cruising life, Martin's story offers a sobering reminder. The ocean demands not just courage and skill, but honest self-assessment and the humility to know when to turn back before desperation drives you to the point of no return.